Hi, and welcome to RAVE Leader Chat number 2 for the Gospel of Mark. I hope your first week went well. It's been a great start to our RAVE groups, and just once again rejoice in your leadership and all that you do to make it work. This week we already start to hit that rub of our passages are going to be pretty long, and so there's lots of different things going on. This Sunday's sermon is going to talk about the first half, but the overarching theme that the the study guide wants to get to is sort of Jesus' authority. They do a good job in the opening question about sort of how we usually wrestle with authority, and then that kind of pairs with one of the later questions, question 9 about how does Jesus use his authority, which sort of suggests that we would wrestle with and how do we respond to his authority. But really the theme that the study guide is trying to get to is Jesus reveals his authority in the Gospel of Mark. And there's a statement in the beginning, which is echoed by most people's understanding of Mark, that we learn about who Jesus is by watching what Jesus does. And so the book sort of says there's 5 little snippets, 5 cameos, if you will. I'd really sort of argue, book says 4, I'd argue for 5. And that first one's kind of a fused one, but we really have the authoritative teaching in the temple. We have the authoritative rebuking and casting out of an unclean spirit. You've got the authoritative healing. You've got the authoritative mass healing, and you've got the authority of Jesus' schedule. And that doesn't include the previous passage of Jesus' authoritative calling disciples in a radically different way than any rabbi of the day. So a couple things I want to give you to sort of maybe deepen some of the conversation. One is Jesus is compared in that first section. Jesus does 2 different things. Jesus teaches with authority, and he gets compared to the scribes. And scribes at the time were religious professionals who were experts in the Torah. They taught the Torah, and they were sort of the lawyer of the day. So think about like priest, professor, attorney. That's kind of how they were held. So for the people to hear Jesus teaching in the synagogue and say he teaches with more authority, he teaches radically differently, that actually says a lot. But that authority in that first section, I want to make sure we see is really recognized by 2 very different groups. In verse 24, the unclean spirit recognizes who Jesus is. The unclean spirit recognizes Jesus' power and authority. And then in one of the questions it asks about how people responded, and all those who were attending the synagogue, they're amazed at 2 things. They're amazed at his teaching and his casting out of the demons. They recognize his authority in several ways. So in that opening section after the call of the disciples, you really have this multifaceted affirmation of who Jesus is by people recognizing his authority. One of the things that you'll probably have great discussion on, and every time we've sort of hit these passages in the past, is the question of why Jesus asked people to be silent. In this study, it actually is given question number 6, which is sort of focused on verse 25, but it appears again in verse 34. And so the question of Jesus' silence is a great one for people to wrestle with. Why doesn't Jesus want people to know? And one of the challenges is we oftentimes sort of read that and kind of go, well, yeah, see, Jesus doesn't want us to share. Well, the classic answer, and I really encourage you to have, for you to wrestle with the question and to have your group wrestle with the question. But one of the classic answers has been that you can't really fully understand who Jesus is until you've seen the fullness of his ministry, which includes the cross and the resurrection. So to tell the story too soon means that you're not going to be able to tell it right, because you're just going to be impressed by one aspect rather than maybe you describe him as a healer or as a teacher without the fullness of his messianic purpose, without the fullness of his servant nature, without the fullness of his walking to the cross and all that means, without the fullness of the resurrection. To miss those last parts of the story is to not tell the full account of who Jesus is. And so that really then suspends that governor, if you will, on our talking about Jesus. We live in the age where We've received the good news. We understand the fullness. We've gotten to see the whole picture. In fact, the Gospels are full of the picture. So that can't be really a modern reason to say, why don't we talk about who Jesus is? Because Gospel of Mark says Jesus told him to be silent. In fact, Jesus says to go to the ends of the earth and teach him about everything that he's commanded. He tells us that's at the end of Matthew's gospel. At the beginning of the book of Acts, he tells them to go build a church in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. We're actually called to go do just the opposite. So as we hit the second week, I want to encourage you to be intentional about welcoming your group. Some of your groups have changed personalities, and so you're rebuilding some of the intimacy. So be intentional about calling people by name, inviting them to participate. And the other is just to kind of remember to prop up these other things. Maybe your group is great at praying together. Maybe your group is pretty reluctant. Maybe talk to one of your people beforehand and say, this week I'd like to share the prayer responsibility at the end. Would you mind starting and I'll finish? Try to find acceptable ways, doable ways for people to take that next step, whether it's in leadership, in prayer, in outreach, in mission service. Try to partner with them beforehand, equip them a little bit so they know that it's coming, and then say, I was really hoping we could share this as a good model for everybody else. I want to encourage you to take those small steps to make sure we're hitting all 6 of those marks of discipleship. I want you to know that I pray for you. I pray for your groups. I pray that God would use us to write his word on our hearts and our minds. And one other thing I want to sort of ask you, if you would encourage your group to attend the annual meeting on January 26th. It's going to be, in many ways, like our annual meeting. We're going to make it a little bit different this year. And so I want to encourage you to as you meet with your group, to kind of remind people that this is potentially going to be a significant occasion for us at Living Hope, and we would love for people to be there. Thanks so much for your ministry. Thanks so much for your passion for Christ and for his people. Continue just to pray for you, and I pray that God would do everything he wants as we continue to draw near to the good news that Jesus Christ is Lord. Thanks. Amen.